So without further ado, Benny, please take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Parker. Obviously, it's a supreme pleasure to be able to present for your guys' community and have some of my folks tuning in. So thanks, everybody, for taking the time. I know that the Zoom life isn't as enthralling and exciting as live presentations, but I guarantee you it will be almost as good. So I'm going to go ahead and mute all of you guys.
How rude.
Inclusive, you guys, all folks. Alrighty. Good evening, folks. Thanks again so much for having me. My name is Benny Jacob Schwartz, and tonight we are talking about a lot of different things, and they all happen to fall under the category of hummingbirds. So tonight's presentation is titled The Marvelous Hummingbird, and we're going to be going from sea to summit. And this is my logo down here, Birds by BIJS. And like Parker mentioned, I do a couple different things. I have my own bird guiding lifestyle brand where I do bird photography workshops. I do local birding tours and international tours. And I also own and operate like a little clothing brand. That's really kind of the goal, is to catalyze conversations around nature, around birds, around kind of outdoor recreation, and kind of include my demographic of folks, because traditionally bird watching is reserved for a certain demographic. And so I wanted to like kind of shift the culture and create more interest with folks similar to my age, so that we start to like talk about it and want to conserve and, you know, protect these open spaces that obviously need our support. And like I said, I do local walks. So these are some of my bird and ecology walks. This was up in Lake Merritt in Oakland, California. I think a year or two ago with some folks. And within my organization, I also do corporate team building events. So for folks prior to COVID, I was taking some businesses out and using nature connection and sustainability as kind of two main pillars for catalyzing this like mindfulness-based approach to bird watching. So what's really sweet about that is that we're able to do it in urban areas and even just in office parks or local, you know, outdoor areas where we tune into the sounds and kind of connect with nature. But obviously that's on hold. But what isn't on hold is this awesome presentation I've got lined up for you guys. So if you've seen one of my talks before, or if you haven't, I like to start broad and over time kind of zoom into more specific topics. And so obviously tonight we're going to be speaking about hummingbirds. But like I said, that's kind of an umbrella theme. And so there's a lot of different lenses and aspects that we're going to examine in relation to hummingbirds. But first off, we're going to start off with what makes a hummingbird a hummingbird. There's a lot of things. Potentially it's their evolutionary history, or is it perhaps their distribution, like where they're found in the world, or their role as pollinators, which is certainly significant. Or maybe it's their unique flying abilities. Or is it their size? Well, we're going to get to that in a moment. But what I do know for sure, folks, is that there are over 360, just about 360 different species of hummingbirds, all which are found in the Western Hemisphere. And up here we have a handful of some beautiful, beautiful birds seen in the New World tropics. We have a velvet purple coronet here. We have a white-necked Jacobin, ruby topaz hummingbird, coppery rumped hummingbird, tufted coquette female, black-throated mango. We have a gorgeted sun angel and an amazing Gould's jewel front. And most of the media you'll see in here is mine. If it doesn't have any photo credits or anything next to it, then you can assume that it's my imagery. And if there are photo credits or tags next to something, I'll generally shout them out and let you guys know who contributed them. Because there's also some friends and awesome photographers that contributed some of their work to this presentation. All right, so Western Hemisphere, i.e. this image on the map. So hummingbirds in North America, let's dive into that for a second. So when we're talking about species richness or diversity, in Canada, we've seen about 5 different species of hummingbirds, but which is not a lot in comparison to the United States, which has about 27 different species of hummingbirds. And then we get even further south into Mexico, and now we're seeing 59 different species of hummingbirds. And you think that's good? Let's take a look in Central America. Now, Central America, as it turns out, are all of these countries here, and they also hold it down with their own reputable number of hummingbird species. And the dark numbers next to the countries are the species of hummingbirds found in each country. So as you can see, each of these countries, even though they're quite small, have quite a diversity of hummingbirds. And we see as we get even further south with Costa Rica and Panama, with up to 59 species of hummingbirds in Central America, which is about the same amount as Mexico. And if we look at the map over here, Mexico is ginormous in comparison to Panama. So we'll skip ahead. In a moment, we'll answer why are there so many hummingbird species in these more specific regions in the Western Hemisphere. And so we're going to dive into South America and take a little look at these numbers as well. So you can see we get into Colombia. So from Panama to Colombia, it goes from 59 to 165. Look at the geographic difference. It's very slight, but the diversity is substantial. Ecuador's got 133, Peru 125, Venezuela 99. I'm not going to read them all, but you can see that as we make our way kind of further south in South America, these numbers actually start to taper off and kind of reflect more what we were observing in northern latitudes in North America. And the reason for that is I would normally pose this question to the audience, why do you guys think we're seeing such a high biodiversity in some of these Latin American countries? And as you're thinking, you're wondering, the answer is because of this tropical region, right? The tropics have a really uniform temperature, and so they aren't subject to the same type of pressures as more northern and southern latitudes. So this tropical region, basically between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer, is what we define as the tropics. And so hummingbirds are only found in the New World or the Western Hemisphere, and their diversity is the highest within the equatorial regions. There's Uruguay with 7. So now we talked a little bit about the diversity. We get it. We get where they come from. We get how many kind of roughly are in each of these countries. Now, when we talk about the evolutionary history of hummingbirds, we can see here on this cladogram, or this kind of evolutionary history branching tree, we can see that actually swifts and hummingbirds actually diverge, which means that they split from being a very similar organism to very different organisms right around this branching on the cladogram. And so some of you are saying, oh, really? How do you even know that? Well, we found a 52 million year old fossil in Europe, which had some conclusive evidence, basically letting us know that swift and hummingbirds had common ancestry at this point in time, which was about 52 million years ago. And so in the pictures here from this scientific publication from Kiska et al., there's two main things. One is that the length of the feet, the tarsus, the bones in the feet, and the bones in the wings in this 52 million year old fossil were basically representing this spot here. They're these like ancient apodiforms. And so the apodiforms split into like apodi, which are tree swifts, and regular swifts like the Vox's swift or chimney swift or white-throated swift that we have here. And then also you can see Trochilidae, the hummingbird family. So I'm not going to bore you guys with that, but just a little bit of background on our hummingbirds. And so they're a modern relic. Another really interesting thing that we observe in a lot of hummingbirds, if not all of them, is what we call sexual dimorphism. So meaning that the male and female birds of the same species look dramatically different. So maybe you've seen like a booted racket tail before, and you saw that it's got a really long tail and it's got the rackets here, but the female below it has the same body, but very different colors and a much shorter tail. There's no fancy tail here. And then the ruby topaz here, we can see is very beautiful, very gaudy. And then the female is far less colorful, what we would kind of call drab. Now, another thing that's really interesting to note about hummingbirds is that they're actually specialized in consuming nectar, which are called nectarivores. And so you can see this is a Allen's hummingbird. This is actually photographed here in Los Angeles County on a Cape honeysuckle. This is not from California originally. It's from South Africa, but as you can see, it still provides an adequate nectar source for hummingbirds. Now, another really interesting thing is hummingbirds and flowers have co-evolved together. Now, ornithofolious means basically flowers that love birds. And so they've actually co-evolved together. So these types of dramatic adaptations don't just happen by accident. They're actually driven by evolution. And what I mean by that is, take for example this cross section of this flower that is exclusively pollinated by this sword-billed hummingbird. This was photographed in the high elevation Andes in Ecuador. And basically, when hummingbirds are visiting flowers for nectar, they're actually not interested in these colorful parts in the front. What they're after is generally in the back of the flower, in the base of the corolla. And so the nectar that's found here is only accessible to hummingbirds that have a beak that's long enough to get into the back of the flower. And along the way, these anthers, which hold the pollen, the male gametes for the flower, get deposited or placed on a certain part of the hummingbird. And so as the hummingbird visits each and every flower, it's transferring the pollen from one flower to the next, and it's basically pollinating the other flowers for the flowers. And what's fascinating about that is in the tropical regions, right, where we talked about, there are 7,000 species of plants that are pollinated almost exclusively by hummingbirds. Now, in North America, we have roughly 125 species of flowers that are very strongly pollinated by hummingbirds. Now, that diversity in numbers is quite a disparity. And again, that reason is because of the diversity of plants and hummingbirds that are reflected in each of these regions. Remember, if we looked in the tropical regions, Colombia has 165 species of hummingbirds, and the United States only has 27, and Canada only has 5. So as you can see, if there's a lot more flowers species, over time, a lot more hummingbirds begin to specialize and diverge and focus on just one type of flower, like you see here with this sword-billed hummingbird and this very dramatic flower. So now we're going to dive into a little bit about hummingbird biology and their adaptations. And I promise you, we are going to talk about California native plants and how hummingbirds relate to those topics. So just to point out, if our bodies ran the same way as hummingbirds, we'd have to roughly eat 1,300 sandwiches a day. Now, to be honest, I thought I ate a lot of food, but there's no way my metabolism could keep up with hummingbirds. Well, what exactly do hummingbirds eat? I mean, they're obviously not eating sandwiches, but they are eating a lot of different things. Now, we talked about before, they are nectarivores, right? They're specialized to consume nectar. As you can see, this male tufted coquette is visiting a vervain hedge in the tropics in Trinidad and Tobago, and it's got a little ring of pollen around its bill, and they consume a lot of nectar. And there's a couple different ways they can access nectar, one of which is a methodology called territory defending. So this is actually a photograph I took on my iPhone at Hahamongna, and this bladder pod is really cool. Parker likes to call it his hummingbird TV because he's got one nearby his office window. And so the hummingbirds basically stake out their claim. Since the bladder pod is blooming generally year-round, hummingbirds have a year-round source of nectar. And so they can just kind of focus on defending their territory and chasing off other competing hummingbirds, and they can just dominate their little patch or area of flowers. Now, that's just one way. Another way hummingbirds maintain their metabolism and get enough nectar is through a process we call trap lining. And as you can see, this photograph was taken by a very good friend of mine, Sean Gracer. He's a very talented biologist and educator, and as you can see, photographer as well. And trap lining is a process in which hummingbirds actually visit a variety of different flowers. And they basically have, just like someone who would be delivering newspaper on their bicycle would have their quote paper route, hummingbirds have their own route through the jungle or the rainforest. And so they would visit plant A, plant B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way until they make their full circle. And so they go from one flower to the next flower. And so they have their little routine. And while they're visiting the next flowers, the ones that they had already visited, the nectar is actually refilling. The plant's producing more nectar. So two things are achieved by this. One is the hummingbird doesn't have to focus its energy on defending one specific patch. And additionally, the hummingbird is able to consume a lot of different types of nectar, which might potentially diversify some of the micronutrients or basically calories that the bird is getting. And like I said before, hummingbirds consume a lot of different things, and it's not just nectar. They do consume invertebrates. And so this is a short little video from Tracy Portraits. And as you look closely, see if you can observe what this hummingbird snags. So for those of you who missed it, we'll put it back one more time. So start the frame, hummingbird locks on, little insect entering the frame, boom, catches it right out of the middle of the air. And so invertebrates are obviously small organisms that don't have a backbone. And there are a lot of different invertebrates that you can observe hummingbirds eating, one of which are mosquitoes, ants, gnats, and aphids. In case you forgot what they look like, they're featured at the bottom of your screen. And sometimes hummingbirds are actually hawking insects out of spider webs, which means they'll go to a spider web, they'll try and tweeze an insect that's been caught in the spider web out. But sometimes they themselves get caught. Now, another really clever strategy hummingbirds have evolved or learned over time is basically to piggyback off of the work of others. Now, here we have obviously not a hummingbird. This is a type of woodpecker called a red-breasted sapsucker. And it's clinging really tightly onto this eucalyptus. And you can see it's got its stiff tail feathers pressing against the trunk of the tree, and its really strong feet gripping on tightly into these little holes. And you can see this tree is basically studded with all these little holes. And these holes are actually built and excavated by this woodpecker. And so the woodpecker drills these holes out, and over a little bit of time, these holes actually fill up with sap. And the sapsucker, believe it or not, sucks the sap or laps the sap up from the tree using its tongue. Now, hummingbirds have actually observed these woodpeckers excavating these small holes, and they too will visit the holes themselves when the woodpecker is gone to lap up some of the sap from the tree. So it's a sugary, energy-rich resource that doesn't cost them too much energy to consume. Now, as we continue to discuss their amazing biology, we are going to take a look at hummingbird flight, because there's more to it than just flying. So this is a little video I shot up at UC Santa Cruz, at the UC Santa Cruz Arboretum, and this is a male Anna's hummingbird. And in this shot right here, you can kind of see how the wings are moving. And so instead of just flapping back and forth, the wings are actually going in a figure-8 pattern. And what that does is it allows the bird to hover in place or fly up or down or backwards, or really any direction. And that's because the bird is actually gaining lift on both the upstroke and the downstroke. So it's a pretty clever adaptation for this bird to continue persisting and being such an agile and fast flyer. Another really interesting adaptation that hummingbirds have is their unique tongues. So here's the white-necked jacobin, and take a look here, and if you can see how unique its tongue is. So the tongues are pretty long. Now, we figured out a couple different things, right? We figured out their tongues, how specialized they are. We observed their flight. We got to learn a little bit about that kind of figure-8 motion. But one thing that is still missing to talk about is their adaptation for sight, right? Because they combine all of these adaptations to maximize the energy around them, right? So they use their sight, they use their tongues, they use their flight, and a lot of other different things to basically keep on going. So vision plays a super important role in hummingbird feeding and their hovering behavior. And so the key thing to remember here is that high retinal neuron density is what allows hummingbirds to really zero in and have such precise targeting. And so high retinal neuron density, what does that even mean, right? Well, we're going to talk about it. So retinal neurons basically are found in the eye, right? The retina is basically, I think, an organ inside of the eye, and the neurons are these cells inside of the eye. And so what they do is they allow information to transfer across them, these neural pathways. And so along this pathway, the retinal neurons are basically transforming this optical image, right? And they're extracting important information relating to light intensity changes and changes in time and chromacity. And so the takeaway here is that these hummingbirds have a really high density of these retinal neurons. So they have a lot of neurons doing the work. So they're basically able to input and translate the information really, really quickly. So as we circle back to a couple more of these adaptations, one of which are the energy requirements and metabolisms of hummingbirds. Because while they're flying, it turns out they actually have the fastest metabolism of any animal other than insects. So here's what I got. This one is from the cloud forest in Ecuador while I was looking at a bird guiding launch early last year. And then here's a slow motion for my GoPro of white-necked jacobins hitting the feeders in Trinidad and Tobago. And then here's another shot from my iPhone in slow motion of a bunch of these booted racket-tails and a couple other species of hummingbirds hovering. So you can see this is slowed down quite a lot. So like we said, they use a lot of energy. And so hummingbirds can achieve a heart rate basically as high as 1,260 beats per minute with up to 250 breaths per minute. Now, these stats were actually observed in blue-throated hummingbirds in a scientific study. And it turns out we have a blue-throated hummingbird right here. It's hard to see the blue throat, and we'll talk about why you can't see the blue throat in this shot. But you might be able to observe it in other shots. And so a little bit of, to drive home the issue about the high metabolism of hummingbirds, take this example about oxygen consumption. So hummingbirds per gram of muscle tissue are actually consuming 10 times more oxygen than an elite athlete. So somebody even as high performance and, exceptionally trained as Usain Bolt is only consuming 1/10 of the amount of oxygen in his blood cells in the muscle tissue than hummingbirds are. And so how do they maintain their metabolism? I mean, that's a lot of energy requirements, right? Like these little tiny organisms that are obviously a fraction the size of these elite athletes, yet they're outcompeting them in a variety of different arenas. And so the answer to this question is called direct oxidation. So as hummingbirds are basically consuming the nectar, their metabolism actually breaks it down very quickly. And so this sugar that's found in the nectar can be converted into ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which is basically energy for our cells. And they can convert that energy from sugar into ATP in about 30 to 45 minutes. So they can turn and burn very quickly. And so that's why you always see hummingbirds feeding, is because they burn their energy quickly and they constantly need to refill it. So here is a grumpy Anna's hummingbird. As you can see, the head feathers haven't fully grown in yet. But the point here is that many hummingbirds actually also store this energy as fat rather than burning it off right away. So I wanted to introduce you guys to the ruby-throated hummingbird. Again, there's a couple ruby-throated hummingbird pictures courtesy of my buddy Sean. And the ruby-throated hummingbird is very interesting. If you've ever been east of the Rockies, this is generally the only hummingbird we have in this area. And so the ruby-throated hummingbird breeds in this kind of in this orange area in the eastern United States. Now, it's not a perfect range map, but it'll do the trick. And the ruby-throated hummingbird doesn't spend its whole year here on the East Coast because, as you guys know, it gets very cold and obviously snows in some parts of the East Coast. And so the ruby-throated hummingbird actually migrates every year from wherever it's breeding across the Gulf of Mexico, which is about 500 miles straight shot flight from its breeding ground, basically a jump off point in like the southeastern United States, to across the Gulf of Mexico, where it lands either on the Yucatan or in this kind of region of Mexico. But their journey is not complete here, and nor is ours. So after they fly 500 miles across the Gulf of Mexico over open water, they continue their journey as far south as they need to, and in our case, the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica. Here's another shot of a ruby-throated hummingbird. This is a little lady, and this little lady's got some jewelry on. Now, this jewelry is called a band. In England, they call it ringing. And so what we do here is we actually place a small little unique bracelet with different little numbers on here. That's basically the license plate for this bird. So if we ever find or recapture this hummingbird using scientific banding techniques, we can say, oh, wow, this hummingbird is XYZ old. And in this case, this hummingbird had actually been banded 3 years ago at this research station that I was fortunate to help out with. That's where I met my buddy Sean. And this hummingbird was actually banded at the research station 3 years ago. So this little lady was banded, and then she went back up to breed for the summer, and then she came back in the fall and then wintered in Central America. And then in the spring, she made her way back up. And so she did that at least 3 different times, this journey. And these hummingbirds weigh about 3.5 grams. So if you're curious what 3.5 grams feels like, crunch up 3 $1 bills, rip one in half, and then crunch that one up and hold it in your hand, because that's about how much a hummingbird weighs. And these little guys fly straight across the Gulf of Mexico. Now, after they're banded, they're obviously safely released and they go about their merry way. But, whoopsies, what's interesting about these hummingbirds is that I said they use this energy and they store it as fat. And just like you would fill up gas in your car to drive to work or go on a road trip, you know, these hummingbirds store the fat just like that. And so as they're flying, their bodies are actually burning off the fat, just like you would burn off gasoline in your car to use it to drive somewhere. So the hummingbirds basically gorge and gorge and gorge right before their migration, so they can store as much fat as possible so they can fly these substantial distances. So next up, we are visiting another migratory species of hummingbird found in a land far, far away, where orcas play and Arctic terns spend their summers, and bald eagles are plentiful. And there are snow-capped peaks, and you guessed it, folks, we're heading up to Alaska. Now, I've spent two summers guiding and working in Alaska, and it's pretty amazing. But we're not here to talk about that. We are here to talk about hummingbirds in Alaska. Now, it may come as a surprise to you, but there is one hummingbird that makes its living up in Alaska. Let me introduce the dapper and ever so dashing Rufus Hummingbird. You can tell it's a Rufus Hummingbird because its back is completely orangey Rufus color. There's no green at all. And so if we have here on our right-hand side, this is what we call a range map. And so it's a map of where this hummingbird in particular can be found depending on the time of year. So the blue means where it's found during the non-breeding season. Yellow is found where the bird is migrating. And then the orange area is where you could see the bird during its breeding season. So generally this is summer, this is spring, and then this is basically late fall throughout late winter. And so as you can see, this is Alaska up here, and the Rufus Hummingbird actually makes its way up into this whole section of southeastern Alaska. And so it's a long distance migrant. This bird is migrating much farther potentially than the ruby-throated hummingbird is. And so when it's wintering in Mexico, the farthest north it could potentially be breeding is up to Alaska. Now that's roughly 4,000 miles. And so these hummingbirds are basically employing a very similar technique as the ruby-throated. They basically fill up on nectar in the tropics, or they consume invertebrates or whatever it takes to get their fat levels up, and then they head out on their journey. But as you can see, they're not migrating over open water like the ruby-throated hummingbird is. They're actually migrating across land. And along the way, they can stop and refuel. So it's not necessarily a straight shot, but they definitely have to hustle and get up there. And the males are the first ones to go because they go stake out the territory. Now, what's so interesting about hummingbirds in Alaska is two things. One of which is they have a very, very close relationship with two special flowers. Insert native plants. So here we have Indian paintbrush. I don't know if that name is still PC or not, but that's what I formerly known it as. For our plant folks, this is Castanea. This is the genus of Indian paintbrush. We all know, for the most part, that it's hemiparasitic. It loves to parasitize off of sage, but it is a flowering plant. And here's a range map of one species of this Castanea. And I'm going to slowly overlay the range map of the Rufus Hummingbird. So watch closely and pay very close attention to the range map in Alaska. Oopsies. So as you guys can see here, basically the range map of the Rufus Hummingbird is identical to the range map of the Indian paintbrush in Alaska. Now, what that means is these two organisms basically co-evolved together. Their range expanded northward as the two of them persisted together. So Indian paintbrush's range is found within the range of the Rufus Hummingbird and vice versa. Now there's another special flower who also has a range overlap with the Rufus Hummingbird. So let's take another look at the Rufus Hummingbird, because in Alaska, its extremes are pushed to the limit. Now, as we recall from that map of the tropics, or maps of hummingbirds in the Western Hemisphere, we had 5 in Canada, 27 in the United States, 59 in Mexico, 165 in Colombia, and just 1, folks, 1 in Alaska. Now, hummingbirds all started in the tropical regions, and over time, as the climate warmed and was favorable, and there was enough, basically, plants and animals for them to consume, their range expanded. So over time, the Indian paintbrush, the Castanea, and the Western Columbine range expanded northward with the Rufus Hummingbird. Now, it's not all fun and games, even though the endless summer in Alaska is amazing. Sometimes we get inclement weather. And so if we look at this photo, this was taken during this early summer in late May in Alaska, and hummingbirds are there basically in the beginning of the summer season. And sometimes the weather gets inclement, the temperatures get really cold, and especially at night. And so hummingbirds can't really go sit and get warm by the fire. But what they can do is they can actually control their internal temperature. So at nighttime, they can actually drop their temperature from 40 degrees Celsius, to 18 degrees Celsius. Or for our Fahrenheit folks, that's about 104 degrees to 64 degrees. Now, this is actually something that we call nighttime torpor. And it's very similar to hibernation, but it's a much more short-term process. And so basically, if the hummingbird senses that it's going to be a cold night, it'll basically just turn down its internal thermostat so that it's operating at a much lower temperature, so it's not using as much energy to stay warm throughout the night. And so basically, when the sun comes out again and the temperature starts to increase, the hummingbird turns off its torpor and slowly awakens from its kind of frozen-like state. Like, it's still alive, but it's very, it's basically operating at its base metabolic rate. So it's like the bare minimum for processing. Like, it's when your car goes on E and the light goes on, you're like, okay, I got to drive very conservatively not to waste the rest of this gas before I fill up. So that's basically what the hummingbirds are doing. Now, like we talked about, this co-evolution, right? So these hummingbirds spend a lot of time visiting flowers, and the flowers spend a lot of time attracting these hummingbirds. Now, it's no coincidence that these flowers are tubular shaped, and that's because they don't want other insects or other animals necessarily visiting them. And so the nectar is the little reward at the base of the corolla. And these flowers have really specific adaptations for their pollen placement. And so if we look at fuchsias, you can see that the pollen is basically dabbed onto the chin of the hummingbird. If we look at the pinks, for example, like this catchfly here, you can see that it's actually depositing at the base of the bill. And then if we look again at the ocotillos, it's actually at the forecrown of the hummingbird. And then if we look at the chuporosas, you can see that the pollen is actually being deposited on the cap of the hummingbird. Now, one hummingbird species could visit 4 different species of flowers, but at this rate, the pollen is so separate that it's actually, the mixing is going to be very minimal. So this way, the flowers can basically guarantee if a hummingbird is hitting them, that it's going to collect its pollen and pass it along basically unmixed up to similar flowers. Pretty genius. Now, as we trudge through our discussion this evening, we're going to continue making our way up to the summit because we already hit the sea and now we're going to hit the summit. So as we talk about high elevation hummingbirds, we're going to talk about something that's really, really unique in the animal kingdom. And that's basically having to deal with low atmospheric oxygen, because as we know, as we get higher elevation, the oxygen level decreases substantially. Now, here we have a ginormous hummingbird who's found at about 9,000 feet in elevation. Now, if we look at this chart that basically has it broken down into a couple different things, we have altitude here in feet, here altitude in meters, then we have basically effective oxygen available in the atmosphere, then we have the altitude category, and then we have some real life examples. So as we know, the air that we breathe is not full of oxygen. It only has 20.9% oxygen at sea level. But take the hummingbird example that we're looking at 9,000 feet, this bird only has roughly 14.8% of oxygen available in the air to consume. Now remember, hummingbirds consume 10 times more oxygen per gram of muscle tissue than the most elite athletes in the world. Now, take, for example, the fiery-throated hummingbird, who's also found up to 9,000, right? Again, 14.8. Okay. Now, let's kick it up a notch. Here's the rainbow-bearded thornbill up in the high elevation in Ecuador. And these guys are found up to 12,000 feet. Now, if we look at 12,000 feet here, the effective oxygen available in the atmosphere drops down again by 1.6%. Now, that may not seem like a whole lot, but it definitely affects birds. And for folks down in SoCal, Mount Baldy is 12,400 feet. So that's what a real life example is. But we're going to take it even higher as we visit the giant hummingbird. Now, this bird is roughly the same size as a northern cardinal, and this bird is a generalist, an elevational generalist. And what I mean by that is that it's found from the sea level up to about 14,700 feet. Now, if we look at the chart again, at about 15,000 feet, that's, whoopsie daisy, roughly half of the effective oxygen that's available than it is at sea level. Now, how the heck do birds do this? Like, how do they get enough oxygen if they're basically just burning through it? Well, the answer is they have a very specific type of hemoglobin found in their blood that actually has more sites to hold on to oxygen. So maybe hemoglobin in our blood, for example, can only hold on to 4 oxygen molecules. Hemoglobin found in high elevation hummingbird species might be able to hold on to 16 molecules of oxygen, meaning that the amount of oxygen they're able to hold on to in their blood is 4 times higher than ours. Now, that's just an example, but the take home here is that their hemoglobin is chocked full with oxygen. So that means all their muscle tissue, which is filled with red blood cells, which is filled by hemoglobin, the hemoglobin basically allows these birds to continue breathing and persisting in these high elevations, even when there's only a little bit of oxygen in the air. Now, one thing that hummingbirds are probably most known for is their feather iridescence. And so as you can see on this velvet purple coronet, the bird is almost entirely covered in iridescent body feathers. And you can see here, this is a wire-tailed thornbill. This is an Ecuadorian photo of a hummingbird in Ecuador. Here's another wonderful hummingbird. You can see a lot of iridescent, and especially in the face. Now, like we talked about a little bit earlier with the blue-throated hummingbird, and we were wondering why can't we see the blue throat? Well, it's because it's not painted on there, and it's not just kind of like this color. In fact, it's actually light being refracted through these tiny little crystalline structures inside the feather barbules. Now, just like you've seen on the cover of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, or you can see in this graph here, the sun, which we basically perceive it as white light, visible light, is basically entering these specific cells. And so you can see the way the cells are basically structured, they absorb all these other forms of light and they refract and reflect back out these specific colors. So what we're seeing here on the hummingbirds is actually light being refracted off of these microscopic cells in the feathers. And so the hummingbirds can basically turn on the lights and turn them off just by moving their body, which in turn moves their feathers and changes basically the position of their feathers to the light. And so effectively changing the viewing angle and what we're observing. If that doesn't make sense, we can talk about that at the end. Now, you're probably wondering, when's he going to talk about anything where I live? Well, right now, folks. So here's a map of California. Here's us in the City of Angels. Here's Pasadena. And in California, we can reliably observe 6 different species of hummingbirds. Here is a gorgeous Anna's hummingbird from up in the San Gabriel Mountains. Here's an Allen's hummingbird from the Sepulveda Basin Wildlife Reserve. Bonus points if anybody can name the native plant in that picture. I'm sure some folks can. Here's a Rufus hummingbird. Here's another shot of it, probably in northern latitudes. On looks like a rosaceae. If anybody's got an idea on that one, extra points. Here's a Calliope hummingbird. This is a very, very small bird. It's just a little bit larger than the bee hummingbird, which is the smallest bird in the world, and it's found in Cuba. We have it here in California. Here's a black-chinned hummingbird. Here's the Costa's hummingbird, kind of similar in its appearance, but a little bit more extensive. Gorget, which is kind of the iridescent face and throat feathers. Now we're going to talk a little bit about native plants and the importance of attracting hummingbirds, or if you wanted to attract hummingbirds in your own backyard. This is a photo from Theodore Payne Foundation, and as you can see here, there's a lot of native plants and a lot of colors. And so we're going to have a short little section talking about native plants and dispelling a really big myth. A lot of people, maybe not folks in this room per se, but a lot of folks maybe don't understand that native plants are actually spectacular. And, you know, California has some of the most magnificent blooms of wildflowers of anywhere in the world. And you can have amazing blooms in your own backyard as well. Now, what I wanted to share with folks is that one thing that's really cool is that you can plant different native plants so that they're flowering almost year-round. And so in this first section, we'll share some plants that are flowering between January and March. So here are some golden currant. Here is some more currant. This is chaparral currant, malvaceum. And then we have plenty of different cacti. These are some beaver tail cactus, opuntias. And then we have some monkey flowers, which are pretty amazing. They come in a variety of different colors. This is like this, these are sticky monkey flowers. Usually we just see these in the field, but there are a couple different varieties. And also in the botanical world, there are some that have been manipulated to have some also really beautiful colors that we don't normally see in the wild, but are still really wonderful native plants to include in your garden. And these are all great for attracting hummingbirds. I've seen hummingbirds hitting all these different types of plants. And then as we get into like the true summer in Southern California, there's a variety of plants that I'm sure on your hikes and outings you've seen flowering super hard. Some of which are salvias, which I believe on the top left we have a purple sage. And then on the bottom we've got a hummingbird pitcher sage, which grow great under oak trees and in the shade. And then we've got some penstemons. And of course, this is by no means an exhaustive list. We have 3,000 endemic plants in California. So this is just to get like, you know, familiarized with the different color schema and the seasonality of these flowers. And then we've got another penstemon below. And then thistles. So there's some invasive thistles and there's some native. This is a native bull thistle. This is a great plant for hummingbirds. As it flowers, it produces nectar. And then for seed-loving birds like goldfinches, this is a great plant as well, because these big flower heads turn into giant seed heads. And then there's some snapdragons. We've got a great example, the island bush snapdragon from the Channel Islands. And that's just kind of getting things going. Now, you may think to yourself, Benny, I've got no space to plant. I just don't. And I say, that's okay. There's other ways to attract hummingbirds to your yard. And one of which is through the placement of hummingbird feeders. As you can see here, this is a pretty sweet hummingbird feeder. Now, you don't have to have a whole lot of space at all. You really just have to have a window exposed to the outside that you could suction cup this little hummingbird feeder on. So you can see these are ruby-throated hummingbirds from the East Coast. There's obviously East Coast picture. And then around here, we have a little water moat so the ants can't climb on here. And then there's 3 feeding ports for up to 3 different hummingbirds at the same time. I got one of these at my house, and it's really cool to be able to see them perching right up against the window. Now, you may be wondering, oh, perfect. I'm going to get a hummingbird feeder, and as I'm checking out, I see a suggestion, oh, I should get this beautiful hummingbird nectar. I mean, it says it's premium concentrate. All I have to do is just add water. And then you think to yourself, wow, it's made in the United States. What could be better? Or maybe you're cruising to your local pet food store, and you're like, oh, wow, red nectar mix. Now that is something to get excited about. It makes 48 ounces of feeding nectar. Huh, wonderful. Or maybe you're at Petco for some reason and you're like, wow, this beautiful bottle of single-use hummingbird nectar is going to look great in my hummingbird feeder. But then you have a revelation. Boom, boom, boom. And then you remember this amazing presentation, no red dye premix. And you think to yourself, wow, I remember no red dye, but how am I going to feed my hummingbirds? They're so angry. Well, folks, I do have a solution for you guys, and it is to make your own solution. Now, what I'm going to share with you guys has been passed down from my great-grandmother to my grandma to me. Now, this solution is very easy. It's a 20% nectar solution, so which means you add 1 part sugar for every 4 parts of water, and that means that there's total of 5 parts, so 1/5 is 20%. And so you just do 1 cup of sugar to 4 cups of water. And there you go. You shake it all up till it's nice and dissolved. And you can use warm water, and you just throw it in the fridge and fill up your feeders when you're ready to go. Now, make sure to clean your hummingbird feeders frequently so that the alcohol doesn't ferment, or so that the sugar water doesn't ferment and turn into alcohol. Hummingbirds don't really like that. And a great kind of rule of thumb is to swap your water out maybe every 3 days, the hummingbird nectar out every 3 days. And in the summertime when it's really hot, you want to be mindful of that as well. And make sure to keep them nice and clean. The hummingbirds, sometimes little like mold or whatever will grow in there. So just make sure to keep them nice and clean for the hummingbirds. And right now is really an amazing, amazing time to get into native plants if you aren't already. Basically, there's a lot of new growth that's happening, so it's a really excellent time to snag native plants. And so if folks are interested in getting native plants, there's obviously a variety of places to get plants, but a really excellent place is obviously Hahamongna Native Plant Nursery. And I gave this presentation like for the first time way before I even like knew y'all at Hahamongna. And so for anyone who's like, oh, is this like a paid sponsor? It is not, but it is convenient that we have similar interests. So for folks that are eager to grab some native plants, head on down to Hahamongna. Every weekend, I believe they've got a native plant sale, and right now is the time. So I'm sure there's deals happening, and check them out on Instagram if you guys aren't already following them. And if you don't live in the LA area, you can always message me or anybody at Hahamongna, and we'll point you in the right direction to get your hands on some natives. Let's see what else I got. That's not what I wanted. Cool. Well, that's all I've got for you guys. Hopefully it was at least moderately enjoyable. I was going to say,
That
yeah,
was awesome. Thank you so much, Benny. That was amazing.
thank you. Let
Really
me
appreciate it.
stop. Let me stop my share real quick, and then cool. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for your rapt attention, and hopefully y'all enjoyed that.
Yeah, thank you so much. You can hear me, right? Am I
Yeah, I
unmuted?
can for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Benny, for doing that for us. That was an amazing presentation. I'm sure everyone is applauding, although everyone's muted, so you can't hear them. But I definitely was really, really into that. That was incredible. I can't believe how many places you've been to and were able to take almost all of those photographs yourself. You've documented so many different species. How many species of hummingbirds do you know? How many that you've photographed, actually?
I think I've seen, I forget what my list was at, but it's well over 100 species of hummingbirds. And there's 360 to see, so I still have plenty of work to do.
100 though, that's a lot already, man. That's
Yeah,
incredible.
it's definitely over 100 for sure.
And how many different countries have you have you photographed them in?
I don't know. They're only in the New World, so I've been to like all the countries in Central America. I've been to like, I photographed them in here, Mexico, Canada, Guatemala,
Everywhere in Central
Belize,
America. Yeah.
all Central America and Ecuador. So Colombia is kind of next on the list. Also Trinidad, Tobago I've been to, and the Dutch Caribbean. So
Are they also in? Yes, so they're also present on those islands around there too, huh?
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, the diversity and like the species richness is like quite a bit lower on those islands, obviously, because the carrying capacity and like the plant diversity is lower. But like Trinidad and Tobago is an amazing hotspot for hummingbirds, like that tufted coquette that we saw earlier. That like insane looking hummingbird. Let's see if I can pull him up again. That guy was from Trinidad and Tobago.
I see one question in the chat, by the way, and anybody else that has them, please post them in the chat, and we will get to them in just a second. In fact, do you want to hear this first one from Claire?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Claire's question is, do you have any tips for identifying hummingbirds for a birding newbie? Which is, I think, a great question, actually. I'm also, I was really interested in, the portion of the presentation that had to do with our local native hummingbirds. So if you could focus on those ones, that would be, I think, particularly useful.
Yeah, absolutely. So I assume Claire Acosta, local means like Los Angeles area. Let's see where
Yeah. I mean, she didn't ask, I don't think, particularly local, but
yeah, she said yeah. So Claire's LA area. So there's basically 3 that we can see here in LA, like pretty reliably. So the 2 that are most common are the Anna's hummingbird. Let's see this little lady. So basically the 2 things is, does it have a green back? Does it have an all green back, or is there more color in the back? So the Anna's hummingbird, as I'll share my screen real quick, this lady here, she has an all green, or this is a male, but the Anna's hummingbird has an all green back. Let's see if we can pull up something to show you the back. Yeah, okay, anyway, so the Anna's has an all green back, and then the Allens and the Rufus hummingbirds are here as well. And so the Allen's hummingbird has orange and green, and then the Rufus has an almost exclusively orange back. So if you're seeing a hummingbird with only green on the back, like your first guess in LA should be Anna's hummingbird. And then if you see a hummingbird in our area that has like orange and green, you can almost guarantee that it's an Allen's hummingbird. And then if it's got a completely orange back, we get these Rufus hummingbirds sometimes we get them in the wintertime, and they also pass through during migration. Those are the Rufus hummingbirds. So those are kind of our 3 main ones. And then I guess for folks that are interested in learning more about birding, I have some bird walks coming up, and I'll probably do we'll probably do one with Hahamongna specifically. So if folks wanted to like get to know the watershed, in the winter, in the fall, and the spring, we'll probably throw some of those out seasonally so we can kind of get more familiarized, because obviously native plants are like the foundation for the community ecology that's happening in our local area.
Awesome. I have another question from Sarah. She says, thanks so much, Benny. Curious to know the birth weight of hummingbirds.
Yeah, so thanks Sarah for tuning in. Basically, they're about the size of they're about the weight of a jelly bean, or like the size of a jelly bean. Honestly, I don't know the weight. I could look that up, but I don't know offhand.
I bet you they're even lighter than a jelly bean, even though it's
Yeah,
the same
they're
size.
probably like a quarter of a gram or something like that, because the adults weigh like 3.5 grams. So it's probably under a gram when they're born, which is pretty insane.
That is insane. Sue asks, I live in Georgia where we only have ruby-throated hummingbird. This year they did not arrive until June. What impacts migration patterns?
Amazing observation. That's cool that you were noting the seasonality in the arrival time of the ruby throat. So there's a lot of things that affect the migration time. It's really hard to say because first and foremost, hummingbirds don't have like a weather app, right? Like they can't like, oh my hip is like tingling, there's a storm coming. Like they can feel the pressure, like the low pressure systems, but they don't know like what the weather's going to be, right? Like they're just kicking it in Mexico or kicking it in Costa Rica, just drinking Mai Tais or whatever. And then they're like, oh my gosh, it's time to go. And that the reason why they know it's time to go is because it's a shift in day length, right? So obviously here we just experienced daylight savings and now it's like dark at 4:45. But even such, we would notice that in the fall, getting closer to the winter equinox, the day length is decreasing substantially every day. But in the tropics, it's almost uniform. So even but however, it's uniform, right? Like it's only like 30 seconds here or there, like in the day length. But the hummingbirds and other migratory birds that winter in the tropics can perceive this really minute difference. And so that's basically their cue to start migrating. But it's interesting why they wouldn't have arrived yet in Georgia, like why they were so late. I'm not honestly specifically sure. Migration patterns, generally the resources are fixed in the tropics. Like it's rainy half the year, it's dry the other half of the year, but it's still raining and there's just like flowers are blooming year round in the tropics. Like it's a whole different situation. But so the birds don't necessarily have as big of a rush to leave. But in North America, when the seasons are changing, right? Like Alaska and the boreal north are like shifting first. So like by August, the temperatures are starting to drop. And then like the birds are just like are pushing their way down North America. So they're much more eager to like migrate. But if there's like warmer weather, it's like longer, like the weather staying warmer longer with climate change, some birds won't actually migrate as quickly. They're just like, oh, there's enough food here. It's still like pretty chill. Like we'll hang out for a bit longer. So a short answer to your question is I'm not positive why the ruby-throated hummingbirds didn't arrive in where you live, specifically in Georgia, until June. But that's a really good question and definitely something I'm going to look into a little bit more. So thanks for that question, Sue.
Awesome. Amazing answer. So thorough. Bettina asks, is it true that eucalyptus trees cause hummingbird morbidity due to the consistency of the nectar sap? /sap.
Morbidity. What does morbidity mean?
Death. Like they die quicker.
Oh, that's a good question. I think that's a myth. Eucalyptus trees are basically like winter apartment complexes for hummingbirds. Although they're not native, there's a lot of discussion around that. They are basically a great host for two species of birds in particular, one of which is wintering hummingbird species and another of which is like yellow-rumped warblers. So if you ever go to like a mature eucalyptus stand or a couple of eucalyptus trees, like right now, like you'll just see a ton of yellow-rumped warblers and a ton of hummingbirds. And I don't think that their death rate is increased by that. I think it's just nectar. And the chemical composition is pretty similar. Obviously eucalyptus have different, negative impacts on our local ecology through like allelopathy. They outcompete and use chemical warfare. But when it comes to the nectar they're producing, I don't think that the hummingbirds are negatively impacted by that. It's a really good question.
Well, that's not convenient for me trying to argue against eucalyptus trees constantly in my work.
I know, that's why I shared both sides of the argument.
Inconvenient truth, as they say, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, eucalyptus trees got to go. Where would they be if they weren't in eucalyptus trees? They would have some other habitat, right? I mean, if they're native to here, they've co-evolved with some other species, right?
Yeah, I think that's like probably a deeper discussion, right? Like exotics versus natives and how are animals utilizing those resources. But it is interesting because like if we look in our gardens, for example, like I was in Griffith Park earlier today and I saw like a decent makeup of species of birds that I also see in my neighborhood. And my neighborhood's like chock full of exotics. So obviously I have like mature sycamores and like definitely some mature oaks in my neighborhood and stuff like that. But for the most part, like a lot of those trees are exotic. And so whatever, it's a longer discussion, but the birds and animals in general are extremely adaptable.
Opportunistic.
Exactly. They're super opportunistic. And so they'll take what they can get. So, I've seen birds do all kinds of different things, just like animals, like deer eat like salmon carcasses, but traditionally they're herbivores. So, the animals don't read the field guides. They do whatever they do. Like, your friend who's a freegan is only a vegan because it's free, but like, oh, I'm vegan. It's like, well, why are you eating chicken? It's like, oh, well, I got hungry. It's like, it's basically the same thing for animals and birds. So they'll take whatever they can get.
Nice. I like the analogy. Robin asks, are there some hummingbirds that are more territorial than others?
Dude, y'all are crushing it with the questions. Yes, absolutely. So in most cases, it actually has to do with size. So like in tropical regions, like in Costa Rica, a friend of mine was doing a research project on basically territoriality at hummingbird feeders. And it was the larger hummingbirds that were displacing the smaller hummingbirds. So a large one would come in, boom, displace the little one. And so that would just kind of keep happening. But in our region, in California, for example, we have, sorry, territoriality. Yeah, so there's like the Annis hummingbird is like the year-round resident. That pink-headed, all greenback hummingbird is basically here year-round. But the Allen's hummingbird, when it comes back to winter, it's like way more pugnacious and way more aggressive, and it'll often chase out the Annis hummingbird. So it's kind of an interesting case because the Annas are bigger and they live here year round. They're like full-time locals. And then the Allen's hummingbirds just show up for the winter and they're like, this is my flower patch. And the Anna's hummingbirds are like, whatever, you'll be gone soon anyways. So there isn't like a across the line, but those are two strong examples of territoriality.
Awesome. Joel Gold says, we get a pair of Rufus in Springfield, Missouri during warm weather, ruby-throated in St. Louis. Thanks, good presentation.
Amazing. Yeah. That's definitely a rare bird. And like at some hummingbird feeder locations, so on the East Coast, for example, a lot of people are putting up hummingbird feeders again, like are leaving hummingbird feeders up. So some birds that would normally like migrate south, which was kind of the opposite of the question by Sue. She lives in Georgia. So some folks in like Virginia and Maryland are actually getting Rufus hummingbirds that are wintering at their house. Normally they'd be like wintering with me in the tropics or whatever, but since they have a year-round food source, they're not forced to migrate. They're like, it's good enough here. Got a little heat lamp, got the hummingbird feeder. Like, Mark's always refilling it. It's good here. I'll just stay. So that's what's happening with the ruby-throated hummingbird, or with the Rufus in Missouri, and then ruby-throated in St. Louis. Nice observation.
We have someone with a cell phone number trying to ask a question. They have their hand raised.
Cool.
Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Tim in Highland Park, California. Can you hear me all right?
Hey, Tim from Highland Park, California. Thanks so much for calling in.
Okay, the weirdest thing happened about 2 months ago. It was right before the when we still had the heat. I've never seen any hummingbirds around my Highland Park place. We get a lot of parrots and things. They come and go. But I came into my apartment one day, and there was this hummingbird in my apartment. And he was hanging out and just flying around by a desk. And all of a sudden, she started sucking on a feather duster. And I called my sister, and I said, this is weird. How did this hummingbird get in my apartment? I must have an open door or something. And she said, well, here's what you do. Put some honey or sugar in water and try to get the hummingbird's attention and draw it out so it'll fly out. So I did, and I tried that, and I tried that, and I tried that, and none of it worked. The hummingbird kept hanging out around the desk and liked to suck on the feather duster. And then all of a sudden, my next door neighbor's girlfriend came up the steps to the top of the steps, and all of a sudden, whoosh, the thing flew out and dive bombed her. And it's like, whoa, maybe the hummingbird thought she was a tree or something. It was the weirdest type of behavior. I've never seen it before. And can you comment on something like that?
I can pretty much comment on anything. Whether or not it will be an accurate comment is definitely not a guarantee, but that's a really peculiar behavior. What I will say is that hummingbirds are definitely attracted to like shape and color. So I'm not sure if your feather duster looked like, was like an orange or reddish feather duster or something like that.
Oh, yeah, it was bright red.
So that's what was happening. So you may have had like a door open and then, or like your window cracked or something. Then the hummingbird saw that from the glass window and then like came in and then kept trying to like hit it for nectar. And then my second guess would be your next door neighbor might have been wearing something like brightly colored or like some type of floral print. Because sometimes when I'm in the field, depending on what I'm wearing, like sometimes I'll get like a hummingbird will like buzz me, or like, when I was wearing more tie-dye and stuff like that, like the hummingbirds, they're just curious and attracted to color. And so that's what's happening with your feeders. Like you put up a hummingbird feeder in the yard, you saw that they're all red, and it's just to get their attention. And then they remember, oh, okay, it's here. I'm going to come back to Benny's yard and hit the hummingbird feeder. And then I'm going to go across the fence because I saw Parker had one up. So they just kind of make their rounds, and it's really attracted to color first and foremost.
Oh, okay. Well, it just seemed weird. I had no idea how it got into the apartment. I might have had the door cracked. I don't have any windows open without screens. And I wondered how it would fly in the front door, up the steps, up the stairs, and into my apartment. It was the weirdest thing.
Yeah. In a lot of indigenous cultures, hummingbirds are like messengers. And especially after like people have like moved on, like passed away or moved on to the other side, like a lot of people report hummingbirds at like funerals. And I've had a friend that had like passed away, and we were doing a ceremony for her, and like the hummingbird came, and her name was like Anais or Anna's, and like so the Anna's hummingbird was like kind of her little messenger. So the animal world works in mysterious ways, and obviously I can try to provide like a logical explanation for things, but obviously sometimes like as too.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that. I was going to mention it, but I thought you thought I was crazy. No, it's like death in my family has been weird as far as birds are concerned. And the first time it happened, when my brother was killed in a construction accident 20 years ago, a bird got into the church and flopped around and got injured, and flopped around and died between my brother's casket and the altar. Oh, and then the night before my mom died, this cat, we were waiting around the dinner table, and this cat brings in this bird in its jaw and wasn't eating it or anything. It just plopped it on the ground, just right there, and didn't hurt it. And then the bird got up, went outside, and flew away. And then 7 hours later, my mom passed away. And then when I saw this hummingbird, I thought, this is really weird. This is twice this has happened now. Maybe there's something regarding a death of something that's going to be important in my life. Maybe I should be alert for that. Sure enough, the next day was the George Floyd killing happened. So I don't know if you believe in that type of stuff, but there sure is weird stuff happening.
Wow. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much for calling in and participating and asking good questions and being vulnerable to share your own history. Like, I think we're all super grateful.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. That was incredible.
Yep, that's what happened. And there's a scripture in the Bible about how a bird will not fall to earth, but the Heavenly Father doesn't see it and knows everything that's happening. And I thought, whoa, when that happened at my brother's funeral, and I thought, whoa, hold everything, you know. But anyway.
Yeah, you got to watch the signs.
Yeah,
thank you, Tim.
okay, thank you.
Appreciate it. Wow, that was great. What an incredible story.
Yeah.
All right. And there's another story from, or a comment from Bettina. Someone from Friends of Griffith Park informed me that their beaks seal shut and then they die. That's regarding the eucalyptus. Good to hear. This could be a myth.
Yeah, I need to definitely look that up because that seems, I mean, it's possible. I don't know that for sure, but that's a really good point. I think I'm definitely going to Google that because I see a lot of hummingbirds at the eucalyptus. I don't know if eucalyptus sap is like any stickier than any other type of sap. So that would be very interesting.
I think I'm going to err on the side of eucalyptus is bad and assume that this rumor is correct, actually. Yeah.
Oh, glad to have you weigh in on that.
Correct. Benny, your knowledge of eucalyptus sap seems suspect at best.
I agree with that.
Paula asks, how do I encourage diversity of hummingbirds around my house? That's a good question.
Well, that's a really relevant topic given all of the things that have been happening in our society. So what I would say is, like, my neighbors just put up signs that talk about racial injustice and equity and inclusion. And I think the hummingbirds are going to get the memo. Like, this is a safe space and they're going to start coming around.
That's right.
I mean, really, we don't have a whole lot of diversity of hummingbirds here. We only have, like I said, like 3 hummingbird species. So it's basically like they're all attracted to very similar stimuli. So like if you build it, they will come. What I would say diversity is, there's no really guarantee on diversity. But the more hummingbird feeders you have up is directly related to the abundance, the number of individuals you'll have in your backyard or wherever.
Or native plants, even better. Native plants are better, don't you?
Yes, think? Exactly. 100%.
But I would also wonder can the feeders be harmful at all to the migratory ones that, because I know with, for example, the monarchs, you're not supposed to use tropical milkweeds in your garden because it confuses the migrating butterflies because of their different bloom times and things like that. Would that affect hummingbirds' migration at all?
Yeah, definitely. It definitely affects it to some capacity, right? Like we were talking about on the East Coast, like birds that like normally head down to Mexico, they're like, it's good enough here, I'll just hang out for sure. And like also like, for example, the Allen's hummingbird, which is one of the 3 common ones we get here in SoCal, was almost exclusively found on the Channel Islands and in the Palos Verdes Peninsula. But over time, as basically urban and suburban sprawl continued and the proliferation of like irrigated plants and a lot of exotic plants and a lot of plants in general were planted, it basically created this like vacuum for Allen's hummingbirds to like basically just like expand their range. And now they're really plentiful around our region. At one point in the 60s or 70s, I forget, they were like, it was a rare bird if you saw it on the mainland. So the feeders definitely affect them for sure.
Right on. See, another reason to just go with native plants.
Go native, baby.
Go native, baby. Paula also asked, do they not have hummingbirds in Australia? And I assume maybe not, because you said they're all New World, right?
Yep, they're all confined to the Western Hemisphere. So in the old world, as we call it, even though that's like whatever, we could get into a whole conversation about that. In the Eastern Hemisphere, basically we have a different group of birds that occupies the same ecological niche as hummingbirds. They're called sunbirds. So we see them in Australia and Southeast Asia and India. So they're sunbirds. They don't hover, but they do similar things.
Interesting. Very cool. All right. That does it, I think, for questions. Wow. Thanks, says Paula. Great presentation, says Sue. There were 1 million kudos from the audience. Everyone really enjoyed your presentation. I know that I did. Thank you again so much for coming out. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. be sure to drop by the nursery this weekend. We're open as usual from Friday through Sunday from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And anybody that comes through and mentions BIJS will get 10% off their entire order of native plants. We've got a ton of them in. We've also got, I don't know if they'll be in this weekend or not, but we're getting in some cool new field guides, including bird guides and stuff like that, all regionally specific to our area from a great publisher that has a ton of rad photographers that they work with. I'm sure Benny knows some of them. Yeah, you guys should come by and check out what we've got going on. The garden's blooming again. It looks beautiful. Everything that was dormant is starting to spring back to life. It's an exciting time of the year, and it's the best time of the year to be planting native plants. So encourage you all to come through and check us out.
Heck yeah. And big thanks to Parker and obviously to Tim for tuning in and, keeping the agenda going. There's a lot of work to be done. So if you're interested in volunteering or getting more involved in either the Royal Psycho Foundation or the Hahamongna Plant Nursery, Parker, how would you recommend folks do that?
Please feel free to email me at parker@arroyoseco.org, or you can direct message me on Instagram at Hahamongna Nursery. Those are probably the two best ways to reach out. Yeah, we have a really flexible schedule right now since we're doing our best to make sure that everybody's safe during the COVID pandemic and these increased cases that are going on. We're really spreading out our volunteers. So instead of doing sort of volunteer days on any specific day of the week where we might have, normally 25, 30 people show up for one event, we're instead letting people kind of pick shifts on their own and select their own day and really allow people to sort of spread out. And that way everybody can still keep working and helping us out, but we don't have to get too close. So that's good. Tim, I see turned on his camera. Tim, do you want to say something? Just waving.
No, I just wanted to thank Benny and to thank everyone who came this evening. I thought it was a terrific presentation. Thanks so much, Benny.
Thank you.
This is part of our program to really establish a very effective environmental education center there at Hahamongna Nursery and really in that whole area where the old Forest Service compound was. So we really want to grow these presentations and lots of other in-person kind of things in the future into a real strong, broad-based environmental education program. So thanks so much for your contribution, Benny, and for everyone who attended. Parker, you are a great MC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Appreciate it. Thanks again, Benny. Thanks everyone for coming out. We'll have this recording hopefully up on the YouTube in the next couple of days for everyone to check out. In case you missed anything, or I'm sure I need to go back and watch some parts again because I get excited about one idea and I'd start thinking about it, and then by the next thing I knew, you'd said something else interesting that I was like, oh man, what did I miss there? So looking forward to seeing that. And anybody that missed it, you can send it to your friends and family who you want to share it with. We'll be posting it on the Instagram and all of our social media in the next couple of days. So stay tuned for that. And stay tuned for more talks coming up from Benny and other future guest speakers. Thanks everyone again. Yeah.